Welcome everyone. People are still joining. Welcome everyone. I don't know if it's morning or afternoon where you are, but welcome to this special webinar on hidden histories of the early modern Caribbean and Mediterranean. We're very happy to have you with us, and I will shortly be passing over the floor to our speakers. But first, I would like to quickly introduce them, and I will move on to the next slide where we can see what our program is. And so, our first speaker is Konrad A. Antczak, and he's a Venezuelan historical archaeologist who received his PhD from the College of William and Mary in 2007. He is currently a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Humanities and Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, Spain, and an historical archaeologist at the Unidad de Estudios Arqueológicos Simón Bolívar University in Caracas, Venezuela, and his research focuses on historical archaeology of the 16th through to the 19th century seafarers, commodities, and identities in the southeastern Caribbean region. Discussing his presentation will be Linda Rupert, who's an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, USA, where she teaches courses in Caribbean and Atlantic world history. She is the author of Creolization and Contraband, Curacao in the Early Modern Atlantic World, and numerous articles and book chapters. She has held fellowships at the John Carter Brown Library, Huntington Library, National Humanities Center, and twice as Fulbright Scholar at Leiden University, the Netherlands. Prior to becoming an academic, she lived for 13 years in Curacao. And I will maybe let them do their presentation, and then I will introduce the next two speakers afterwards. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will pass over the floor to Konrad.
Well, thank you very much, Zachary, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. And so today I'll be presenting on the ArCarib project. It's a two-year project funded by the EU. It's a Marie Curie Skłodowska action, and its main objective is to understand archaeologically the informal trade, or also known as contraband, which I'll discuss, between Venezuela, Bonaire, and Curacao in the 17th and 18th centuries. So just to begin here with the region, for some of you perhaps, the Venezuelan Caribbean as an idea might be new. Venezuela actually has 60 islands in the Caribbean, and it has the second longest Caribbean coastline, nearly 3,000 kilometers of Caribbean coastline. So let's say in the historiography, in the general understanding of the Caribbean, it's in a way the underdog, although as you can see here, it is in many ways the gateway to the Caribbean. It has been the gateway to the Caribbean since deep prehistory. So focusing on here, we'll be talking about the 17th and 18th century in this region. The province of Venezuela and the adjacent provinces belonged to Spain. And beginning in 1634, Curacao, which was before that a Spanish possession, was taken over by the Dutch West Indies Company eventually, and Aruba and Bonaire, which were adjacent islands, soon also fell into Dutch hands. And as you can see here, Venezuela was really, these islands were in the zone of influence of Venezuela. They were really close or within the Venezuelan Caribbean, the southeastern Caribbean. And up until this very day, these islands, their proximity makes for many shared cultural and historical features between the islands and the continent. So today, the territorial waters are rather arbitrary, as you can see. They don't do justice, perhaps, to all of these interactions here that occurred for more than 400 years, at least in the colonial period. And you can see here, for example, how close these islands are to the Venezuelan mainland. So Curacao is some 6 hours sailing away from Puerto Cumarebo, which is on the Venezuelan coast, and Klein Bonaire is some 9 hours sail. Bonaire is also really close to the Las Aves de Sotavento archipelago, which is a Venezuelan archipelago, some 5 hours away by a sailboat, that is, which is something which was the only means, really, except for canoe, of transport at the time. So this is the background. This is the background of the region, of the area. And let's dive in. I won't have that much time, so I'll just go through this fairly quickly, but I hope with enough detail, and then you can ask questions, sorry, if you need more answers. So why was Venezuela so important, and why this whole topic of informal trade? So Venezuela in the mid-17th century became a really big producer of cacao. And eventually, the cacao from Venezuela in the 18th century would become the most precious, the most sought after, the best cacao in many ways in the world. It would end up in places like North America, Europe, for example, Barcelona. Venezuelan cacao was very prized. And it was mainly grown in these low-lying coastal regions, so on the central coast of Venezuela. I'll show you in a map soon, and in various valleys in the province of Venezuela. Here you can see cacao drying in one of these valleys in the Bay of Chuao, which was a major cacao producing center. You can see here this map from the 1720s, where you can see the central coast of the province of Venezuela with many of these cacao plantations. These cacao plantations, the large ones, belonged to a landed gentry of sorts. There were the Mantuanos, the Amos del Valle, the Grandes Cacaos, as they would call them, mainly of peninsular or Spanish origin. But in between them and in other places of the Venezuelan coast, there are actually many arboledas, so many cacao groves that belonged to not to these elite, let's say, peninsular criollos, but to even enslaved people, freedmen, freed people, indigenous people, and also poor white canarios, among others. And these were some of the main motors, let's say. These were some of the main people who would eventually export cacao illicitly, through illicit means, using informal networks to Curacao. So the central Venezuelan coast and its adjacent areas in the 17th and the early 17th century, the indigenous encomiendas that were there, so the indigenous people who were placed into these kind of forced work arrangements, soon weren't seen as enough of a labor force to work on these growing cacao haciendas. And enslaved Africans were brought in mainly, eventually, through Curacao itself. So to this day, these areas are populated with Afro-Venezuelan people, and there's also quite a bit of indigenous heritage in many cases as well, as we'll see in some of the ceramics here. So Curacao, in 1634, Curacao was taken over by the Dutch, and it became a vibrant entrepot for trade with the larger Caribbean and with North America, and it mainly traded in Venezuelan produce. So cacao was this main product that was being traded, but also hides were being traded from farther inland Venezuela, mules, emeralds from the Kingdom of Nueva Granada, the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, sorry, and other products such as tobacco. But cacao was the main cash crop that was being siphoned off, let's say. And some historians even say that upwards of 50–60% of the cacao that would have gone to Spain or eventually to Mexico was actually siphoned off by the Dutch from Curacao through their different connections off into the Northern Atlantic and into Europe. So this was a really important hub in the region. And Curacao developed Willemstad, you can see here, which was in Anbay, which was the main port, a deep, really good port, proved to be an ideal location for ships to come and go. But it wasn't actually really the Dutch from the Netherlands who were the main motors of this informal trade with tierra firme, with the Venezuelan mainland. It was actually the Jews or the Sephardim who escaped in part from Pernambuco once it fell, the Dutch Pernambuco, but also immigrants from Amsterdam who came in the later mid-17th century and settled here on Curacao. And you can see here, for example, the oldest synagogue in the New World and the oldest cemetery, the oldest Jewish cemetery in the New World as well. The Sephardim were merchants, they were seafarers, and they drove a large portion of this informal trade with the Venezuelan mainland. They would go up and down the coast. The ships that they owned were actually manned in many cases by multi-ethnic, multi-racial crews. So Venezuelan indigenous people from Bonaire, from Aruba, enslaved people, freed people, Spanish, meaning Venezuelan criollos, and Dutch. The crews were really diverse, and they reflected really what was going on here, that this was a major outlet for the Venezuelan products, but also Venezuela, the Venezuelan provinces were really the Spanish, this was kind of a backwater in many ways of the Spanish Empire. And Spain really sent very few registry ships or ships that would bring goods to the provinces, and they were really needy. So they needed basic supplies like textiles, like flour, for example, ceramics, and the Dutch, the Sephardim here from Curacao, provided Venezuela with these essential everyday items in return for cacao. So up until this day, up until recently actually, now the border is closed, this connection was still very strong. And Venezuelan tres puños, here you can see Venezuelan sailing ships, for example, would come to Curacao all the time. And they would really supply Curacao, Aruba, and Bonaire with fresh produce, with fish, with meat from Venezuela. And in this way also, foodways became, the sea was not a barrier for foodways. It wasn't a barrier for exchange of culinary practices as well. And this is something that this ArCarib project is especially interested in, to see how these identities on the Venezuelan coast and also on the ABC Islands changed and adapted over these 200 years. So you can just see here briefly the different routes that were taken by the informal trade. So I don't have much time. I will jump straight to the case study on Bonaire. So in 2019, there was this archaeological survey that I undertook on Bonaire, trying to locate a transshipment point. And why a transshipment point? There's documentary evidence that indicates that Bonaire had warehouses, especially in the mid-18th century, that were used for transshipping cacao to Curacao and transshipping goods from Curacao to the Venezuelan mainland. And I located one of these warehouses on the small and inhabited island of Klein Bonaire. There's actually, this is the ruin of this warehouse. It was not a habitation. It was made from this limestone and coral filled rubble walls. It had these ventilation holes, which were quite possibly used for ventilating the cacao sacks or the bales of textiles or the hides that were being stored here. We excavated at this site. We excavated 15 trenches, many test pits, and we found some really interesting evidence of what was happening here at the campsite adjacent to this warehouse. These are some of the finds in situ. These were the things that the people who manned the campsite used and left behind. One of the more interesting things here are these ceramics. These are criollo ware ceramics, which this project is still analyzing. I'm still doing archaeometric analyses of these. But my hypothesis is that they were brought with the cacao from the Venezuelan mainland, and these might have actually influenced foodways on the islands. On the right, you can see these cobble round bowls. These were Dutch Delftware bowls that are very common on the ABC Islands and also farther inland. Some of the other finds you can see here are very curious. For example, there's this red cylindrical bead here that perhaps wasn't necessarily used by a Dutch person. If we're starting to interpret who might have manned this campsite, who might have been here, there's these two coins which give really interesting dates that help to ascertain better when this campsite was in use. So a late 17th century date for the Spanish macoquina and a 1710 date for this other coin. And more importantly here, you can see these bale seals. So bale seals were seals attached to big bales of textiles. And as we know from historical sources, textiles were being traded to the Venezuelan coast. So possibly even they were being repackaged here at the site of Post Cangreo on Klein Bonaire, and then sold less in bulk, let's say, in different places on the Venezuelan coast. So everyday items, there's pewter spoons from the first half of the 18th century. They were fishing here. We found zooarchaeological remains. We found fish remains as well. And one of the interpretations here that I have so far is that the warehouse was possibly built by the West Indies Company using enslaved labor, but the people who manned this campsite were possibly indigenous Bonaireans and freed people. So there's tenuous evidence so far, but for example, the glass bead might have been used by some of these people. And also the food practices indicate that these probably weren't Dutch soldiers who were garrisoned in the fort. You also even have here something that this is also something I'm working with, but perhaps this hoe that might have not really been used on the island for agriculture because it's a dry island. Might have been an instrument called the chapi, which is a traditional Bonairean percussion instrument. So finally, just to end here, these are also some really curious finds. We found these cannonballs. They might have actually been fired by Spanish corsairs who usually harassed and took ships from this informal trade. They might have actually fired them at the campsite, knowing that contraband was happening here. And there were also fragments of a musket here and pistols. So they were armed, they were protecting something and something valuable, which was probably here in this warehouse. So yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions. And I give the floor now to Linda.
Thank you very much. And Konrad's going to put back up one of his maps here because I think it's very important as I make my brief comments for you to just have really clear what this relationship is between these islands that were in the Dutch sphere and the very long coast of a relatively marginal part of Spanish America, or what one historian has called a vital periphery of Spanish America. Not Peru or Mexico or Cuba, but a place that had its own dynamic. Some historians have also conceptualized as colonial centers. So this area in the wider historiography might seem rather marginal, but in fact, when you look at it on its own terms, it's really quite important and has a fascinating dynamic. Konrad gave you some really good and important background to understanding his work. Unfortunately, because of time reasons, that meant he didn't do justice to the richness of the archaeological finds he has. And I hope that more of that can maybe come out in your questions to him. I'm going to very briefly situate his work as an archaeologist in the historiography of smuggling and contraband trade, but then really hone in on what I think is some of the exciting work that he is doing and how important it is to have this archaeological material. Informal maritime commerce is what he's titled his presentation. My students get more excited if I call it smuggling or contraband, and then they really want to learn about it. And it's certainly true that smuggling, contraband, this kind of trans-political commerce is global and has been going on from ancient times, from prehistory to the present. And that's been very well documented. But there's a challenge in studying it, which is the limitation of the sources. By definition, this kind of trade that transgresses political boundaries and goes against the grain of well-established political spheres goes under the radar. That's the very nature of it. And so it's very difficult to measure quantitatively. And historians have struggled with this any time and place that they have tried to study this kind of trade. And the challenges of limited material in the archive. Smugglers, unlike so-called legitimate merchants, are not going to keep really detailed records of how much they transported, what exactly they transported, who they traded with. It goes against the very nature of what they do. It's also challenging because this kind of trade occurs between separate political spheres that the archives, the written documents we do have, portray it very, very differently, right? The Dutch archives, which I have studied this zone and this topic, the Dutch archives see this as, legitimate trade. They downplay the role of local people, and we'll talk more about that in a minute if time. But they're very aware that, yes, this is what our merchants were doing. The Spanish archives, on the other hand, and I've had the pleasure of spending time in different Venezuelan archives as well as in various archives in Spain, they call this not only smuggling, but sometimes they call it piracy, right? Just out and out, and it's illegal. It's not just informal. It's not just under the radar. It's flagrantly illegal. And in this very zone that Konrad has depicted so well for you, there were Spanish guardacostas, Coast Guards patrolling this area, trying to entrap and imprison the people who were involved in this trade. So we also have a central contradiction in conceptualizing this kind of trade, which historians of this kind of trade are very interested in, because on the one hand, it's quite obviously challenging, in this case, empire, but any time and place it occurs, it's challenging established power spheres, right? The people who came from Curacao to Venezuela were crossing zones, political zones, and challenging. So it's kind of seen as subversive. But on the other hand, the very fact that it challenges these borders means that it recognizes them in a sense, right? It affirms them in a sense. So it gets a little bit conceptually difficult to really parse this. Now, in the case of the Caribbean, smuggling, informal trade was recognized as central to understanding the region's very history. It's really kind of been central. And I'm not a historian of the Mediterranean, but my sense is that that is also true for the Mediterranean. And in this zone between the Dutch islands and Venezuela, it's especially rich. All right, I want to turn for a few moments to then what I think this archaeological contribution that Konrad is doing is contributing to this kind of this study of smuggling or informal commerce more generally. First of all, I really like the title, the emphasis on informal maritime commerce, as opposed to the emphasis on transgressing boundaries. Because for the people who were involved, and as Konrad said, it really is worth reiterating, this was the livelihood of local people. This was not something that happened from afar in Europe, right? This was the bread and butter of people who lived there. And so it wasn't illicit for them. It was how they survived. And this was true both for the people on the islands, on the Dutch islands, and the people along the coast of Venezuela. And it bears really reiterating that the majority of people involved, certainly in Venezuela, were of African descent, enslaved and free. But even a high percentage of the traders from Curacao were either enslaved or free men of color who sailed, as well as Sephardic Jews who at the time were not part of an elite. They were a merchant group that faced some sort of discrimination. They had been expelled, their ancestors had been expelled from Spain. So these are groups who don't directly represent the political structure of the Dutch realm, of the Dutch Empire. So kind of reconceptualizing this and putting front and center the people themselves. Second, I can't stress enough how important this archaeological evidence is, because the written records are so sparse and often contradictory. The real evidence for what was happening, who was doing it, what kinds of goods not only were being traded, but what other kinds of goods, like these weights and these measures that were being used for weighing these things. It gives us this material culture, gives us a whole insight, not only into the trade itself, but into the lives and work experience as laborers of these people who were involved. And that, I think, is really, really central. Third, I want to say the time period. When we think of trade, even smuggling, we tend to think of 18th century, 19th century, and on into the present. This late 17th into the 18th century is a pivotal period. A lot was changing in this region, in the Caribbean, and in the global experience of empires. And to really understand at multiple levels how important this period was. Finally, just a couple of brief comments, because I don't want to go over, but reconceptualizing this particular area. It's a small area. Step back on the map. It's a tiny area of the world. Why is it important? Why should we care? Because this exchange zone between two different imperial zones really helps us think more generally about the limits of empire, not just how smuggling challenged empire, but also how empire was constructed from the ground up by people who were there, because the Dutch could not survive. They would not have kept their colonies in this particular area if they did not have these traders. And even Venezuela, as a relatively marginal part of the Spanish Empire, could not have continued to survive without the income that was coming in from these traders. So I think rethinking the role of this informal trade as it constructed empire and as it sustained empire in this period is absolutely vital. And if we think about moving across boundaries, what does that say again about how these political constructs were made? So those are just a very few remarks I have. I do hope that in the Q&A, you'll give Konrad an opportunity to talk more about some of the very rich material he's found. And if you want to talk about hidden histories, this is certainly one of these hidden histories that is right under our noses, and only hidden because historians have either chosen to ignore it because of who was involved, or have had blinders on because they were looking for something else. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Konrad and Linda. Yeah, just wanted to mention, because I didn't say it before, if you have questions for any of the speakers, please write them in the Q&A section, as we will get to a Q&A time at the end of our session together. So let me just quickly share this again so we can see what's coming up. And so now we have Giulia Bonazza, who is currently in the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Fellow in Columbia University, New York, and Ca' Foscari University, Venice, with a project titled The Darker Shades of Black: The Value of Skin Color in the Mediterranean and Atlantic Slave and Labor Markets between 1750 and 1886. She is a former fellow at the German Historical Institute in Rome and former Max Weber postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. And she is an associated member of the Centre International de Recherches sul, I think this is French, and so I'm struggling, but CNRS in Paris, and a member of the management committee of the Italian Society of Labour History. She's involved in the project Datas, documenting Africans in transatlantic slavery. And discussing her presentation will be Dominique Rogers, who is a senior lecturer in early modern history at the University of Antilles, and is a founding member of the CNRS since 2005. She's worked with many international programs on the topic of slavery, and her main interests are slavery, color, and women. So I will hand over the floor now to Giulia.
Thank you, Zach. First of all, I want to thank the organizers, so Zachary and Francesco. I'm very happy to share my research here with many colleagues, and I think it is an interesting experiment to put together different European projects that have something in common, but with really different methodological perspective. And so I will share my PowerPoint. Okay, do you see it? Do you see the PowerPoint? Okay, perfect. So today I present a part of my research and really the first result of my project. Because last year with the pandemic, I was not really able to search in many archives, but I have tried here to put some first result of my first archival research. The aim of this presentation is to show, one moment, I'm not able to move, okay. Is to show how the skin color, physical appearance, health status, age, the ethnic origin of captives, slaves and workers affected their value and mobility before and after the legal abolition of slavery in the second half of the 19th century and the 19th century. I want to find out from the sources whether there was a correlation between the market price of slaves, the captives' exchange value, and the working condition of workers of color. I would understand if these qualities, such as skin color, gender, age, that was attributed to them by vendors, buyers, masters, how this attribution affect also the mobility or immobility of slaves and workers of color after the juridical abolition of slavery? Is there a correlation between the legal end of slavery and the immobility of slaves and former slaves based on skin color? I focus on case studies in the Mediterranean, for today Tripoli and the Italian area, and in the Atlantic, Martinique. So briefly, the scholarly research of slavery in Mediterranean has essentially concerned the early modern period from the 15th century until the 18th century. And we have many studies more on captivity system in Mediterranean, and we have studies on slaves in France, in Portugal, in general, for the European countries who had a formal colonial empire in early modern period, but we have less studies for slavery in countries such as Italy or Germany that had a late empire at the end of the 19th century. And in general, we can say that the issue of the value of skin color and working condition are mainly perceived as a colonial problem rather than an European problem. So in my paper, I make a first attempt to compare some slaves prices in different type of market in the Mediterranean context and the Atlantic context, with the case studies situated in Italy, Tripoli and Martinique. So also in the maps that we found, the important atlas of slavery in the world, we can say that how in this case we don't see trade in direction of all the Southern European countries, but in reality there was a trade also in this country. For the Mediterranean area, in Palermo, in October 88, there were 62 slaves. And Father Paolo and Monsignor Castelli, who were in charge of the ransom operation, had to exchange the Turkish slaves with 28 Christian slaves. Therefore, we can suppose that the exchange value was around 2 Turkish slaves for 1 Christian slave. The exchange value in terms of black slaves was inferior than the Turkish Levanter one, 2 Christian slaves for 5 black slaves. Another document informs us that the Bey of Tunis did not accept the exchange of 18 Tunisian slaves because they were black and not Levantine slaves. As I have demonstrated in my book, the fact that exchange value of a black slave was inferior to the value of a Tunisian, not black or Levanter one, proves that the color of the skin was an important element in Mediterranean slaves exchange. And from a commercial point of view, a black slave was a merchandise with an inferior value. In terms of mobility, this is interesting because the Levantine captives and the non-black slaves from North Africa have more chance to come back in the native land. On the contrary, for black slaves, it is difficult. One of the reasons is that probably black slaves have not a family in the Barbary Regency or a state that have an interest in ransoming them. So it's not really the color of the skin in itself that has an economic impact, but the color of the skin as a symbol of a geographical origin and situated in a context affecting the possibility of exchange. Not only skin color and ethnic origin was an important aspect concerning the trade of men, but also age, skills, and health status. In Genoa, in 1762, we have 18 slaves considered incapacitated. The majority is considered incapacitated for their age because they have more than 63 years old, so they are blind or asthmatic. In reality, there are also young slaves who are blind or without legs and feet. In the letter written by the Dr. Pietro Francesco Pizzorni under the order of the deputy Stefano Lomellini, the older slaves are considered not able to work in galleys, but also to attack some minor vessel of Christian. In general, it is quantified as saving of 2,000 lire in case of elimination of these slaves, because the expenditure for their maintenance is quantified in this sum each year, and they do not produce anything. For this reason, he proposed their freedom without any compensation. Moving to Tripoli, in this source, prospetto del commercio di Tripoli d'Africa e delle sue relazioni con quello d'Italia, we found lists and prices of different types of slaves after the abolition of slave trade of 1807 and also after some legal abolition of slavery. And in particular, we found that black eunuchs cost between 315 and 400 sceriffi, black men from 19 to 100, but in general we can say that black eunuchs are really expensive, and also black women, and also that beauty a physical characteristic had an impact on the price, and not only the age and the gender. So moving to the Atlantic case, so in this case Martinique, we have only slave prices and not the exchange of slaves, as often happens in the Mediterranean, we can say, captivity system. The price depends on many factors: ethnic, racial category, gender, skills, age, and health problems. Consulting a database built with Notarial Act, this important database, Esclavage Martinique, was an important project that also Dominique Rogers made. We can analyze some prices for the period 1776 and 1799. Also in Martinique, we have all the slaves and with the health problems as in Genoa, but they still have a price estimate even if they are no longer considered productive in the plantation. For instance, we have a slave black named Timothée. He is 74 years old and he is infirm, and the estimate of his price is 200 lire that I transform in silver, so it's more or less 50-56 grams. Furthermore, we have Jérôme. He was cooperage, and his price, even if he is infirm, is 1,500 lire in silver, more or less 4 kilograms. In general, it seems that the price variation of all the slaves and slaves with health problems depend on their skills and the job they did when they were healthy. Also, old women and out-of-service women have the same price variation in relation to the work, such as men. Only one old infirmed woman in the database result to be ransomed, but the other, both men and women, don't. So we can observe that there is a difference between the slaves in Genoa, who can return in their original land, who lost the economic exchange value, and the slaves in Martinique that, even if they are old and with health problems, they cannot come back to Africa, or they are early free. The aspect that really influence the price are the type of task or work the slaves performed. The more expensive slaves are women and men from 20 to 50 years old who work as waiters, household refiners, masons, carpenters, and commanders, cooks, hairdresser. The children have almost all the same price, but the female children are more expensive than the male children, probably for the future reproductive capacity. This aspect is similar in Mediterranean, as we have seen. In the list of slaves prices in Tripoli, the female children and girls are more expensive. In some comparison between the prices of slaves in Mediterranean and slaves in the Atlantic, more or less in the same period, we can try to evaluate some similarity and differences in the period 1796-1804. Even if at the stage of the research, the quantitative cases are limited in these prices, I don't consider the cost of transport. To conclude, comparing two slaves who made the same work as a sailor in Mediterranean in the Atlantic, we have, for instance, in Martinique, in 1796, Jean-Baptiste, 20 years old, de fine negre, The estimated prices is 2,000 colonial lire. In silver, his value is 5.5 kilograms. In Mediterranean, the value in silver of a sailor who made the same job in Palermo in 1802 is more or less 2 kilograms. So his price is less than the half of the slave employed as a sailor in Martinique. These cases demonstrated that the price of a slave in Martinique is in general higher than the price of a slave in Mediterranean with the same work or age. In terms of mobility and immobility of slaves, it seems that the mobility was easier in the city on the Mediterranean basin and less in the plantation system. But also in Martinique, we have rented slaves who change often plantation in different cities or colonies. Also in Mediterranean, we have cases of captives that escaped. For instance, in Italy, many slaves, as in Caserta, escaped during the Napoleonic invasion. So this is really the first result of some case studies, but in my more larger project, I want also to compare the condition of workers of color in the second half of the 19th century. So as many Black people who lived also in Italy, as Michele Armatore was a soldier during the Risorgimento Wars, with the condition of free people of color who worked in the colonial work. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks. So we'll hand over the floor to Dominique now.
Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. It's morning for me and afternoon for those who are in Rome, I presume. So the main question, one of the main questions that Giulia is dealing with is the question of color and of skin color in Martinique. I'm not going to speak about Italy, since I'm not a specialist, but my point would be to try to see how to make some remarks on what concern the project concerning the Caribbean side of the Caribbean side. So the main question is that of the skin color, and of course it is a very pertinent question. It is a central question for the Caribbean societies, who are, since the end of the 17th century, mainly racialized society, and are still are nowadays, more or less. But however, so skin color is a criteria of beauty, is a criteria of social hierarchy, and white being supposed to be at the top of the society and black being at the bottom, whereas all the nesties, the mixed ancestry people are in between. However, we should not always forget the fact that we are Martinican societies, French Caribbean societies, are societies in which you can be phenotypically white and consider yourself as black, or being considered as such. Second, at the same time, you could be recognized or assigned as a black person and being accepted with the white people. So saying that, I wanted to think that point which is a bit lacking in the project is the question of race. I'm not so much a race person concerning explanation, but in this particular context, I don't think we can just rely on what the sources are saying concerning skin colors, labels of color. We need to take into account the race, the question of race, to handle part of the question. Second, we also have to mention the fact that the question of white passing, which I allude very briefly to which I meant, sorry, I'm a French person trying to speak English. there had been a study made by Jessica Pierre-Louis, which is mentioned in the footnotes of the paper, but which is not used in the presentation and in the longer paper. We cannot. I think it is important because it reminds us of the capacity of the people of color, the Martinican society to include people, to insert or assimilate people without always taking into account their color. Of course, Jessica is dealing with people of color. Exactly what she speaks is assimilated person. But I think this question is important, especially for the second, what happens after the abolition, which is in the main project, one of the main questions that Giulia is trying to deal with. And I think there could be perspective to be reused by Giulia. And it is for me what is the very new, very interesting question that she, and I was a bit surprised that she chose to deal with Bailey for the 18th century, whereas for me, what is very interesting in your perspective is to try to understand what happens after the abolitions. After the abolition for Martinique, because there has been only one abolition for Martinique, contrary to Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, and Guyana, that is the one of 1848. And we do lack a lot of information concerning what happened to those new freed after 1848. That would be very important to know more. And for this particular question, we have to, contrary to, I mean, there are more things than only Signan Larcher. We just wanted to remind you of Jean-Pierre Sainton works, Le Nègre en politique, Couleur et société dans les contextes post-esclavagistes, which could be of use for comparison, and mention also the difficulty of this research, because of course, as you know, I presume, since 1831, you don't have any mention of colors in official text. So of course, it is what you're trying to do is not well, it's audacious in a way, at least it's difficult, but it's of very much of importance because of the importance of color in this society. You would have to take into account representation, on which you have quite a lot of information, but also real case study. And I think that is the good point, what you're suggesting, trying to find people and see how they've been surviving and inserting in societies. As you rightly mentioned, you would have to compare with the engagé, the indentured servant of the 19th century, for which you have Céline Fleury's work and Christine Schnackenburg work on the Indians. The second point you want to try to work is the question of the price of the enslaved. That is it was for me a very original perspective, because most of the historiography is going away, is concerned with works do not deal with merchandisation of the enslaved or commodification of the enslaved. That is a very new perspective, at least from the French perspective. And checking, we do not have any systematic work on this particular question. Even Jacques de Conat, working on a plantation, doesn't speak of this particular question of the price of the enslaved. We mainly work with Frédéric Rajon, who assert the fact that there's an hierarchy founded on color, origin, and sex, and in which a mulatto is much more valued than an African, than a Negre, that's a black person, and where the Creole is more valued than an African, and where a mixed person of mixed ancestry would be much more valued than a mulatto, whereas a mulatto and a Cap would remain quite close in value. So. And he said, just as you said also, that the value of the slave depends on the activity, on his capacity, and the fact that he is un libre à talent, that he has technical skills. If we think, shall we, and therefore even a skilled slave, but a Creole skilled slave would be valued more than an African skilled slave. That is the conclusion of Frédéric. If we think, is this, because we have no other systematical study, we tend to rely on this one. But if we do look at what the little thing we have on Saint-Domingue, we could be reminded of the fact that the value of the slave changes in this big island, 27 times Martinique, and according to, I would say, les lois du marché, the law of the market, and if you are in an area where there are lots of slaves coming, the price of slaves are lower, whereas you are in places where the slaves are not so numerous, their value would be higher. And therefore, the question of prices is difficult to handle, because you have, for me, to take into account using price as a criteria of evaluation of importance is therefore a little bit difficult, because you have to take into account the question of economic dimension. If we refer to Martinique, I would suggest to compare, although the island is smaller, maybe to compare the urban zones, Saint-Pierre, Fort-Royal, and to the rural areas, and see if the prices you find, the information you have are the same, and not to remain at a global level. The question, of course, is to know, is it only a question of market, or is it a question of regard on what you think of slaves? And this only a systematical studies could help us to know. For this reason, I think the work you're trying to do would be of great interest. What you want to do for on the prices of slave, you mentioned the fact that Nègre, Creole, Griffe, Capre didn't have preliminary observations that those people didn't have roughly the same color, the same price. But I just wanted to mention the fact that Griffe and Capre are rather dark, dark-skinned slave, just like a Nègre and Creole, usually Creole being just a synonymous for a Nègre Creole. And therefore you should maybe appreciate the situation by really, as Frédéric Réjean is doing, by taking into account the very light slave, and not only taking into the fact that we have a use of color in a lot of nuances of color in the French West Indies, and it's not so white, black, and mulatto. There's a large scope, and in any kind of discussion you have to take into account this variety. The idea of age, gender, of state of health is very innovative, very new for the French West Indies, and therefore it's of great interest. We do not have a lot of studies on children, on esclaves surrogés, very old slave, and of course it would be a very great interest to do that. And of course, I wanted to add something. If you seem to be surprised by the fact that the old slave were not freed, were not so much freed. In fact, they could not be, because it is not compulsory to free an old slave without giving him a pension. So that is why you do not have this automatic process, this facility, and it is more often easier for an owner to give him the statute of an esclave de fait, statut libéris, in which he remains on the plantation and he lives the way he wants it. But there's no process of engaging the owner to pay something on a regular basis. That is why it is not so common in the Martinique or in the French West Indies on a more general basis. I wanted also we have a lot of works concerning women as resistance leaders, as workers, but no systematical studies on the prices. And I very welcome this kind of information from your side. I had two questions reading your paper, and one was the question of, it was a tiny question of mobility. You mentioned the question of the mobility of the slaves, and I was wondering whether you meant geographical mobility or whether you were alluding to a social upward mobility, social mobility. So I wanted a little extra information on this point. Second, my main question was, why did you try to, I understand that you've been working first in Italy and now you want to try to the West Indies, but I mean, what is the link? Is there a true link between those two spaces so far away? And so why such a comparison? If you want to keep on this way, just wanted to add a few remarks on the question of the ransom. Of course, you don't have an African family who will ransom the slaves, but if you want to work on this question, you could use the question of the price requested by the master to free the enslaved. This practice, which is of course forbidden by law, is very often ordinarily is frequent, and so therefore you could go maybe to see what price is asked by the master and see and maybe derive information from that, which could help you in your comparison process. You could also deal with the administration column, the price the administration is asking to free for the manumission of the slave. That could be another way of trying to think of the value of the slaves. The preliminary work done on those questions for Saint-Domingue suggests a very very varied value, very different from what is written in official documents on those questions. But therefore, a systematical study could allow us to have a much more precise idea of this question of value of the enslaved. However,
sorry, Dominique, I'm going to need to ask you to wrap up so we can get on to the
I was just about to do that. So I think your project is extremely rich, and it is at its debut, at this beginning. And my recommendation would be maybe to reduce it a little bit, because the first project was, 750 up to 1890, and I think that's too much. For me, I just wanted to remember that we have more than 100,000 enslaved in Martinique at the end of the 18th century. And if you want to make it really a systematic work, you're going to be overwhelmed, especially if you want to go as far as the end of the 19th century. But for me, what is really interesting would be to deal with the second part of the 2nd century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique. So we'll let Giulia respond to some of those questions after our next presentations. So now we are heading to our third and final project presenting today. So we have Chelo Naranjo Orovio, who's a professor in the Institute of History, CSIC. She is currently director at the Institute of History, CCHS, in the CSIC. And she is the author of diverse books, scientific monographs, and book chapters. She has been the editor of collective works and more than 70 research essays published both nationally and internationally, written individually or collectively as a result of intense scientific collaboration with numerous specialists in the relevant fields. She has lectured and given conferences at several universities in various countries in Europe and America. And furthermore, she has organized and participated in countless scientific events and contributed to more than 80 congresses, both in Spain and abroad. She is a member of the Academia de Historia de Cuba and Academia Mexicana de Chancas. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and I apologize. And discussing her presentation, her project will be Hector Pérez Brignoli, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Costa Rica and the National University in Costa Rica. And between 1976 and the present, he has published 20 books, 14 as an author and 6 as an editor, and more than 60 articles in books and academic journals. His research and publications have covered the fields of economic and social history, historical demography, and historical geography, and political and cultural history. His geographical areas of interest include Costa Rica and Central and Latin America, with a comparative approach that avoids simplification. So now I will be handing over the floor to Consuelo or Chelo.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Francesco and Thad, for the organization, for organizing this seminar and for the introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I would like to briefly present the project that I am directing, titled Connected Worlds, the Caribbean Origin of Modern World, which started in 2019 and will finish in 2024. ConnecCaribbean is not just a research project on the history of the Caribbean. It represents an opportunity to establish stronger links between the territories of the Caribbean, Europe, and Latin America. The proposed research topics invite networking to achieve considerable comparative and transdisciplinary results. As in the main thought, the Caribbean has been a key player in the shaping of the West, a main stage in the emergence of global capitalism and an origin of modernity. Networking will help to establish connections between scientific communities that, despite their geographical proximity, sometimes have very limited links. Likewise, networking research among a large group of scholars will not only encourage cooperation, but will also encourage comparative work through the pooling of case studies that will highlight both differences and similarities in national histories. The multidisciplinary nature of the groups that make up the network allows us to study the topics we put forward from different approaches: economic history, social, political, cultural history, history of science, and anthropology. With a transnational approach, issues that shaped the Atlantic world since 1492 will be addressed, some of which survive in the Caribbean region: the trade and the slave system, race, racism, imperial policies, resistances, the circulation of knowledge, images, representations in and of the Caribbean, and development models. It involves 104 researchers from 15 institutions in 10 countries, 4 European and 6 Caribbean and Latin American. In Europe, Spain with 4 centers in Madrid and Sevilla, Germany, France with 2 centers, one in Paris and the other in Martinique in Université des Antilles, Italy, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Cuba, Colombia with 2 centers also, one in Barranquilla and the other in Santa Marta, Puerto Rico, and Chile. The general of the project are at least 5. 1, to rescue the historical, social, cultural, and political autonomy of the Caribbean beyond the history written by and from the great empire's perspective. 2, to study using a comparative approach the Caribbean societies from the element that generated the Atlantic world. Other is to analyze the Atlantic circulation of people, ideas, tradition, literatures, and products. 4, to promote a between institutions in Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America. The last objective is to obtain an understanding that recognizes the traces of Europe and Africa in the Caribbean and vice versa. Another point that I would like to highlight is the benefits of the project. We think that the Caribbean could facilitate the development of Caribbean countries and generate a future that values the integration and human diversity, overcome the racial complex and the scourge of slavery and its traces in the area and its perception by other regions of the world. In this way, the project could give visibility to certain groups and generate awareness and knowledge of practices of racism in citizens. Also, we think that the investigations could help rescue historical memory and promote cultural expressions. Finally, we think that this project contribute to designing public policies to combat stigmatization and racism against non-white population. From the beginning of the project, we carried out different activities and publications in order to disseminate and communicate the first result of the project. In this way, it is important to highlight the publication of some books for the educational community. One of them you can see is open access, titled The Caribbean Origin of the Modern World in English and in Spanish. I would like to focus on one of the objectives. I am talking about the African slavery and in the Caribbean and the African cultural legacy in this region. Modern times cannot be understood without considering its significance in the development of the international labor market, the exploitation of American and African resources, and the capital accumulation resulting from such exploitation. From the 15th to the 19th century, Atlantic slave trade was one of the driving forces behind capital accumulation and labor that would transform human societies. The enslavement of millions of Africans helped to cement capitalism, the enrichment and industrialization of some European countries. It is necessary to analyze the relationship between economic growth, labor, slavery societies. One must take into account how society evolved historically and how this explains social and racial dynamics. Over the centuries, slavery and its memory have led to a stigmatization of those who were slaves and sometimes of their descendants as well. Superficial physical differences such as the skin color of African population help to reinforce ideas of constructed distances between population. This helped justify slavery and later and now exclusion and racism. Based on these ideas, it was easy to establish social racial stereotypes to remain to this day, even though contemporary biological science discarded the concept of human race many years ago. Genetic analysis clearly shows how human population have been continuously moving and exchanging their genes, meaning that many of them who appear different in their physical form are directly related. This aspect has been studied by the researchers of the project. Their investigation has produced different publications, seminars, conferences, and also videos and documentaries in Spanish and English. And one book you can see, an exhibition titled Slavery and the African Cultural Legacy in the Caribbean. This exhibition will open in Madrid on October 7th at the Museo de América. Everybody is invited to the exhibition. To conclude, I would like to present a short video about this topic. As you will see, the Caribbean region is a multicultural territory inhabited by various human groups that have developed particular forms of life that they define as their own. Cultural syncretism reveals that the trace and presence of African culture in the Caribbean. This region is a physical and symbolic representation of the miscegenation processes that mark colonization and the construction of the identities of societies in which mainly indigenous, African and European culture at intertwine. Thank you very much. And now we can see the short video.
Okay, you can see the video on the screen.
Yes, thank you.
El bergantín vigilante de Nantes fue un buque empleado en el comercio de esclavos que fue capturado por el teniente Midmay en el río Pony, en la costa de África, el 15 de abril de 1822. Tenía 240 toneladas de carga y llevaba a bordo 345 esclavos. Los esclavos fueron encontrados tendidos de espaldas en el piso inferior. Los del centro estaban sentados, algunos con las piernas dobladas debajo de ellos, descansando sobre las plantas de los pies. Entre los barcos esclavistas más conocidos por sus vicisitudes se hallan el Zong, cuyo capitán en 1781 lanzó por la borda a más de 100 africanos para aligerar la carga. O el caso del buque Recurso, en 1840, que disimulando ante las autoridades ser un barco esclavista, llevaba a bordo barras de hierro formando enrejados, grilletes y paños, como los que se usan para guardar esclavos, una cubierta de esclavos completa, gran cantidad de agua y de barriles, gran cantidad de arroz, carne salada y pan, una caldera capaz de cocinar para 300 o 400 personas y gran cantidad de leña. La esclavización de personas constituye uno de los episodios de mayor trascendencia y vergüenza para la humanidad. El comercio de esclavos, también conocido como trata atlántica, se prolongó desde el siglo XVI hasta mediados del siglo XIX. Durante este largo periodo, más de 12,5 millones de africanos fueron trasladados al continente americano y obligados a trabajar y vivir como esclavos. Gran Bretaña, Portugal, Francia, España, Dinamarca, Países Bajos, Alemania y Estados Unidos participaron en la trata en distintos momentos y con diferente intensidad. El proceso de esclavización produjo la invisibilización de las etnias y de las culturas africanas. La riqueza y diversidad del vasto continente africano quedaron olvidadas durante siglos y reducidas a la oscuridad y el olvido. Francisco Arango y Parreño, ideólogo de los hacendados azucareros de Cuba y artífice de la liberalización del comercio esclavista, escribió en 1832: «Los esclavos coloniales trabajan en general más de lo que deben. Se les castiga cruelmente. No se les alimenta, viste ni asiste sus enfermedades como corresponde. Pueden casarse, pero considerados como bienes muebles, el amo o su acreedor puede separarlos del lado de su compañera e hijos y privarlos de los únicos consuelos de su miserable vida». Hubo que esperar al siglo XIX a que el abolicionismo se abriera paso en las sociedades esclavistas. Junto a los capturados viajaron ideas, plantas, alimentos, religiones, lenguas, tradiciones y conocimientos que se desarrollaron y mezclaron con otras tradiciones en tierras americanas. Cuba, ñáñigo y bachata; Haití, pudú y calabaza; Puerto Rico, burundanga; Martinica y Guadalupe me van poniendo la casa; Martinica en la cocina y Guadalupe en la sala. El ritmo de África recorre todo el Caribe en la canción festiva para ser llorada de Luis Pales Matos. A pesar de su rico legado, la memoria de la esclavización ha quedado silenciada en muchas sociedades europeas y americanas, quizá intentando borrar el horror de la esclavitud, o quizá tratando de ocultar el origen de algunas fortunas. La esclavitud y su memoria han provocado a lo largo de los siglos una estigmatización de quienes fueron esclavos y en ocasiones también de sus descendientes.
Pensamos que analizar todos estos aspectos a lo largo de la historia puede contribuir a profundizar en los problemas que actualmente tienen los países que están enmarcados en la cuenca del Caribe. Creemos que es sumamente beneficioso poder estudiar cuáles son los legados, como una forma de reivindicar el mestizaje cultural, la riqueza del Caribe y hacer visible aquellas poblaciones, tanto indígenas como afrodescendientes, que no tienen el peso y la voz en estos momentos que deberían tener.
Este proyecto contribuye a dar a conocer una parte de la historia y a desmontar y deconstruir los estereotipos de los que se alimenta el racismo.
Thank you very much. And now, finally, we'll hand over the floor to Hector.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here in this very, very interesting activity. And of course, this idea of hidden histories of the early modern Caribbean and the Mediterranean seems to me really very, very attractive. And of course, Chelo has presented with this project all the question of the slavery and the larger than that, all the question related to the importance of the Caribbean region as at the origins of the modern world. And of course, this is a very old question that I guess it was Eric Williams, the very first that began with this idea. But of course, now the approach we have to this question is larger, very much larger than the Eric Williams approach. And we are including, of course, as Chelo presented, all of course, the question of slavery, but also the question of this big space, which is the Atlantic circulation of ideas, culture, etc. Now, I will call the attention to two other hidden histories of the Caribbean. One is related to, it was already presented by Konrad and Linda, and this is related, of course, to the importance of smuggling and all this illegal trade. And I will just very, very rapidly present an example from the Caribbean coast of Central America, because when we are talking of the Caribbean, if we talk about the Caribbean basin, all the coast of Central America, which is at least 1/3 of the territory of the Central American Isthmus, is Caribbean. So if we look at the Caribbean coast of Central America in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, we can see exactly a similar picture to the picture that Konrad presented for Venezuela and the Dutch, the island Curacao and Bonaire, dominated by the Dutch. But the question is that all this smuggling that was not only related to the traffic of merchandise, of commodities, that was also a continuous exchange of cultures, races, people that Linda underlined very much in Linda Rupert in his presentation. The same thing is present in the Caribbean coast. And of course, for the most of the Central Americans, this is a hidden history because I don't know, well, the explanation of that is complicated. And of course, in that case, the question of the sources is the same problem. One thing is, if you look at the Spanish sources, it's one thing. We have to look also at in Jamaica to the British sources that are really important to illustrate this continuous exchange related to piracy, to smuggling, to all this illegal commerce that was really an important part, a functional part of the whole colonial system. Was not just a kind of what we can say disease or something anomalous. It was really an integrated part of the colonial system. We have, I have I don't have time, but another hidden history of the Caribbean and Central America is the question of we have on one side the persistence of authoritarian regimes. If you remember, when Garcia Marquez wrote the novel, The Fall of the Patriarch, that is the story of a dictator, a typical Latin American dictator. Well, he is a dictator from the Caribbean. It's a literary construction, but is a dictator, a very old dictator from the Caribbean basin. And of course, the hidden problem is not the authoritarian regimes itself. The hidden history is the history of how to explain this persistence of authoritarian regimes. Because now it is clear we cannot look only to a structural determination. If we look at Nicaragua now, in Nicaragua we have dictators along the history. We have the Somoza family dictatorship, 42 years in power. That was a typical dictatorship coming from the Cold War system. But in a very different system now, we have Daniel Ortega as a dictator now, and he is a son of the Sandinista revolution. But now, with all now we have elections in November in Nicaragua, and all the opposition is in jail or exile. It is really a dictatorship and a family dictatorship who is in progress. And well, a very different kind of regime, Fidel Castro, 50 years in power. Well, how to explain this persistence of authoritarian regimes within the region? If we look early at the other day of the Haitian Revolution, we have Henri Christophe, the king, Henri. So, and it was it at the very beginning. So how to explain that? I don't know how to explain, but this is a big question. It's still a hidden history of the early modern Caribbean. And perhaps it's related to the Latin component of, because perhaps in the British Caribbean or that Caribbean, we don't have this kind of regimes, political regimes, perhaps. I don't know. This is an open question, of course. But thank you very much. I will finish here because we are almost over the time.
Thank you very much, Hector. And so I want to quickly give us, if people are willing to stay for another 10 minutes, a chance to answer some of the questions. And so I think Giulia has to go soon, but maybe I saw that some questions had come in for you. So specifically, also what Dominique had asked, what do you mean by mobility? And why are you comparing specifically the Mediterranean and the Caribbean? What do you see as the kind of the reason to comparatively study these two areas?
Okay. So thank you, Dominique, for your useful comment and feedback, very useful at the beginning of our research. And so in reality, mobility is a new concept that I introduced in my research recently, because in my original project, it was not an element. But after I write another paper more on the Mediterranean case, and I think it could be a useful element to add to the problem of skin color, value, and prices. So in this case, it was mainly geographical mobility, but in reality, for the Mediterranean case, I have already written some articles also on social mobility, in particular after the baptism, and also the escape as a social mobility, because in the Mediterranean, often slaves escape in country or in territory in which they know that they have better chance to be freed. So I think it is also social mobility is an important element to explore. So why it is big comparison? Yes, I know that it is also quite dangerous, this big project, maybe more a size for an ERC project. So probably I will reduce it, also considering that this year with the pandemic, I was not able also to come in Martinique, but also to travel in Europe. Only recently we can travel in Europe. And because I think it is useful to compare some reality in Mediterranean and some reality in the colonial world. I know that the danger, and for instance, I think your suggestion concerning urban slavery could be could be very intelligent, because now I think that I can compare maybe some slaves cases for the urban reality in the Mediterranean, and for instance in Martinique or in Cuba, if I maintain Cuba as a case studies. But I think it is interesting to explore this connection, because there are emerging studies also, as you know, slavery in Europe. This recent volume, also slavery in German states. They show something new, that is not only captivity in the Mediterranean. So I think even if the Mediterranean slavery, the Atlantic slave system are two different systems, I want to try to find some similar type of market in a small cases, maybe urban market, slave system, or trading in port, and compare it in the two spaces. I know it is dangerous, but I will try to do it in a precise way, to do serious comparison and not to do a comparison that that is not defensive. So I will be happy to discuss also with you about more about my Martinique case. And many thanks, because your observation were very fruitful and very, very useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Giulia, and thank you for the questions. And so now I just wanted to ask a couple of questions that showed up in the Q&A for Konrad. So the first one was, so these are from Enrique Moral from Universidad Pompeu Fabra. And he asks you if you were able to find evidence of the presence of women in the warehouses from Bonaire and Curaçao, since they seem to have been very male-dominated spaces. And the second question is, I would like to know what sort of written sources are available in the context where you have excavated, and what ways those documents dialogue with the material evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great questions, Enrique. Yeah, so the evidence, this is always a difficult topic to approach via material culture in these kind of scenarios. And for example, in my previous research that I couldn't really mention much because of time, I worked at campsites that were in large portion, most probably all men who came there. They were sailors. But here, the really curious thing about Klein Bonaire is that since it's right in front of Bonaire, which had a small settlement there in the 18th century, it had a Dutch fort, and there were indigenous Bonaireans, there were free Bonaireans and enslaved Bonaireans who lived there. It's actually quite possible that the people who were at the campsite, who were looking after the warehouse, weren't only men. And otherwise, I mean, it's 15, 20 minutes by boat rowing from the island, maybe half an hour if there's a strong current. So food could have even been brought to them there, yet they cooked at the campsite. We have zooarchaeological remains. We have remains I'm still working with, probably a pig and maybe even goat, cabrito, which is one of the meats, goat meat, which is one of the meats that's really common on the islands, and fish, local fish, probably large jacks, so pelagic fish, which could have been caught in front of Klein Bonaire. The water is quite deep, very fast, and they could have used hook and line maybe to catch these. So it's my answer is I'm still working with it, but it's quite possible that women were the ones who were cooking at the campsite for the overseers there, who were in charge of discharging the merchandise from the ships. So they would have maybe had a canoe in front of the campsite. The ships would have anchored off of the island in close proximity. Actually, a colleague of mine, Ruth Stelton and Alex Hinton, two colleagues, they performed underwater survey here, and they found an 18th century anchor really close by. So this was something that would have been happening. So yeah, it's a bit of a roundabout answer. I'm still working with evidence, but this actually might be one of the few sites that I've worked with where women were actually present. And there was a second question as well, right?
The second question was about what sort of written sources are available in the context where you are excavating or where you've excavated, and what ways does this written these written documents dialogue with the material evidence that you find?
Yeah, so this is something that Linda mentioned. It's one of those. those problems when researching informal trade, when researching contraband. There just aren't many sources. But some of the sources that do exist are, for example, comisos. They were lists, court records, pretty much, of everything that was confiscated from on board ships that were caught by the guardacostas, that were intercepted. They were taken to port, usually in La Guaira, in Venezuela, but also in La Habana, in different other Spanish ports. And everything on board would have been registered, and there would have been a trial. And so we have quite a few of these comisos, and they indicate what was on board. But nonetheless, and this is something that this project is trying to get to, they probably would have not indicated everyday things. So they would have indicated things that were maybe in bulk, primarily in bulk. So textiles, cacao, obviously. But if ceramics would have been found on board, I have a feeling that they might have not appeared, and they don't appear in any of these comisos. They might have been something that was just considered to be what they were using on board to cook. So this is something that kind of slips below the radar. And some of these ceramics, I presume, came from Venezuela. Soon I'll know for sure. But yeah, there's also court records not only in Venezuela but also in British North America. So in the British colonies of today's United States, very similar. There would have been different corsairs and privateers that would have caught these Curacao ships. And we know what was generally on board, who was on board, so who was the complement. And this really gives the idea of how diverse these ships' crews were. So yeah, that's I actually had to go to the General Archive of the Indies, but I did manage to do my fieldwork last year, which was a godsend. It was this tiny window that I had, but I haven't managed to go to the Archive of the Indies yet, and that's where I'm going to be looking into some of these comisos, some of these.
But it probably doesn't tell you the sorts of people that were at the campsite, though, right? No, exactly, and that's one of the things that we don't know from documentary evidence, because this campsite was actually, there's no documentary evidence so far that I found for this warehouse, for this campsite. And like I said, these were probably indigenous Bonarians or freed people from the island. There's actually this coin here on the right-hand corner here that you see in many archaeological sites in the Americas. These pierced coins are taken to be amulets, tokens that were hung on the neck. In many cases, there's evidence directly from enslaved cabins or areas where enslaved people lived on plantations in the Caribbean, in the southeastern US. So it's a tenuous link here, but it's a possible link that also enslaved people or a freed person was here. These were in some cases charms that were associated with African belief systems. There's quite a lot of research done on this, but I don't want to be just kind of forcing the evidence right now into a mold. All right, thank you so much to all our speakers. It has really been a fascinating webinar, and I know we could continue talking on and on for a long time, but we better let everyone get on with the rest of their day. I'd like to thank all the attendees, and if you would like to get in contact with any of our speakers to ask them more questions or to discuss their research, I'm sure they'd be happy to speak with you, and I'm sure you can find their contact details online or through the event page, which was published on the ArCarib website. And I believe the recording of this webinar will also be made available on Konrad's YouTube page as well. And yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, and we'll be closing here. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, Zach and Francesco, for organizing this, for your patience.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Have a good day.